I think Derek came into filmmaking kind of by accident, as a profession anyway. He started off making Super 8 films, which were essentially private. They were made for screening at home to his friends, which is where I and many other people first saw them, I think. And he had no intention at all of exhibiting this stuff publicly. Nothing could be further from his mind.
When Derek started making films, he got his friends to help him. So that his first films are of his friends in the warehouse or opposite St Paul's Cathedral, just on the south side of the river there. And he just went around filming people sitting on sofas and doing various things. And then gradually they became a little bit more ambitious and they started actually doing things. And so his friends were the people who helped him make these movies. And that's really how most of his movies were made. They were not like making movies, they were like home movie making. It was fun, it was like a party, you know. We'd go down to the Butler's Wharf later on, where there was a nice, convenient, empty space beside it. And we'd light bonfires and jump around and pretend to be this or that or the other.
Derek, I think, drew on people who were around him, in some cases lovers, friends, friends of friends. He was lucky enough to have a number of people around him. I think the two key figures would be Christopher Hobbs, who was in many ways a mentor for him and helped him enormously make the transition from painting to filmmaking, as a profession, that is. Another one would be Andrew Logan, the late Andrew Logan, who was not a direct influence in anything that Derek did, I don't think, but was an inspiration to him. I mean, was also a totally isolated figure, a one-off, a unique figure in British marginal culture at that time, particularly marginal gay culture at that time, but helped and guided Derek endlessly, I think, over the years.
Well, one thing you have to remember about Derek is that he was very much at the hub of the sort of social milieu of London in the late 60s and the early 70s, and whether that was the kind of David Hockney set, Celia Birtwell, blah, 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 all of that, or what I call the Andrew Logan All-Stars, which was Andrew Logan, Dougie Fields, various artists that, again, were kind of early 70s kind of iconoclasts of some sort.
The sudden explosion of punk as a movement, as a protest, a nihilistic kind of expression of rage, frustration, impotence, anger about the state of things in Britain in the mid-1970s, coinciding neatly with Her Majesty's officially ordered celebrations commemorating her 25 years on the throne. I think these were the ideas that fed into Jubilee.
At that time, I mean, I suppose the punk scene really actually started about in 1975. And it was actually the bulk of the people, the hardcore of the original punk scene, were all the kind of Roxy Music, David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust kind of fans. And by that point, even those people had seemed to have become remote. And it was a weird fusion of like bits of the gay scene, the lesbian scene, obviously seditionaries and sex. You know, Malcolm McLaren, Vivienne Westwood's boutique was key to it all. But, you know, someone like Jordan, she was like the kind of figurehead of the whole thing. And hanging out with Jordan, with Kenny and Susie from the Banshees, people like that. And it all cross-pollinated with the leftovers of, I suppose, the sort of 60s counterculture thing. So, but we were all this new Bolshoi gang of kids. And it was a moment where those two worlds fused, the end of the hippie thing, and this new bunch of kids, essentially, who didn't, you know, I didn't give a shit about the Rolling Stones or the Beatles. I thought it was like boring old rubbish.
I first met Derek at an Iggy Pop concert at the Rainbow about 1976, and I took Scott Meek and Tony Rayns to Iggy Pop, and we had a spare ticket, and he brought Derek up, and he was a very strange man, very, like, didn't say very much, but I started chatting with him. We went and got our coats at the end of the show, and we ended up having a little chat, and he went, I'm doing a film about punk. Will you be interested in you know, getting involved? And I was like, yeah, okay, lovely. You know, I mean, I didn't think anything of it.
At that time, I was an art student. I think I'd just started my first foundation course. I was actually, you know, from a very working class background, but I'd been to a Jesuit school. They got rid of my Cockney accent, made me speak nice. Everyone on the punk scene were like upper middle class or aristo type people, pretending to be common as muck working class yobs. And there I was speaking like little Lord Fauntleroy. And it struck me as a huge joke, actually, that all these people were pretending to be common, and I was doing everything in my power to be, you know, highfalutin and posh.
After I met Del, I mean, like, we just become really good pals. And I think for him, it was good that he had sort of like somebody that was, you know, not so much on the scene, but I was, you know, I wasn't really, I was, you know, a punk or whatever, but I was like, I was actually a communist, and I was 14 years of age. And here I was kind of like, you know, mouthing off about movies and politics, and Derek found that attractive. And I mean, I come from like East London, and you know, my father was like a pub owner.
I'd been to a party, it was after a Susie and the Banshees gig, and Kenny Morris, who was the drummer in the Banshees then, was my best friend. We went to this party afterwards with Jordan and Vivienne Westwood and a few other people from the band. And basically, I got off with this guy and Kenny got off with this girl, and they happened to live together. And the next day, the guy said, "I want you to come and meet a friend of mine." And he took me around to this other house somewhere in Chelsea or Fulham, and it was Derek Jarman, who said, "I'm making a film about punk, and we need some real punks to help us with the production design." And so I was like, "Yeah, sure, why not? I'll definitely do that."
The research for it, I think, was basically him going out and going to places he wouldn't necessarily go. Derek was, you know, as I say, he was quite a well brought up young man, and but he liked a bit of, like, you know, a bit of gutter, and he went out and just trawled it.
The casting of Jubilee was, I think, a very hit and miss process, and it had a strange mixture. I mean, one now finds this more commonly in independent filmmaking, but it had at that time a rather strange mixture of professionals and non-professionals. And because a certain number of the cast were drawn from people actually involved in the punk movement, who all were very much into self-presentation. I mean, they were actors perhaps before they knew it. Some of them went on to, of course, become professional actors.
In 1976, I started work at the National Theatre alongside Ian Charleson, and Ian took me along to meet Derek to have tea with him. And I walked into Derek's flat, and there was a script on his sofa, and it wasn't called Jubilee, it was called Down with the Queen, something like that. And Derek just said, an aside, he said, "Have a look at that and pick a part." He said, "As long as you don't take amyl nitrate," which was to be played by Jordan, he said you could have any part you wanted. So I flicked through it, and I saw who had the most lines, and I chose Mad.
Derek was around town, and he was great friends with some friends that I was great friends with. There was a sort of like an art group with a guy called Andrew Logan, who was like had the big studio, and I was very much in this group. One day, somebody called Miss Mouse, who's a fashion designer, she had a afternoon party at her flat, and she invited me to it, and Derek was there filming. And that was the first time Derek filmed me, and from that he said to me, "Oh, well, you know, would I like to do something?" And we said, yeah, and that's how it sort of started.
When I looked at the script, Mad was by far my favouriteest character because she enhanced complete chaos and anarchy, and there was a lot of potential to go off on tangents and just do things a certain way, which made me very excited about the part. And also because, you know, she was a pyromaniac and was slightly loony, I just felt that I could get away with murder in playing the part. It was my first film. I'd only ever done one stage play fresh out of drama school, and I hadn't got any of the technique that some of the other actors had, especially Jenny Runacre. I didn't have any of that control and grace, so I wanted a part that I could just let rip with, and I did, and in many ways paid the price, because some people were appalled at what I did. But I just kind of was unharnessed, and Derek made no attempt to harness in my energy, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
And the thing with Del is he always used to take people off the street. It was very much in the Paul Morrissey kind of thing, where if the face was good, then you put them in the picture. And as I say, a lot of the people in it, like Adam, nobody knew who he was, but everyone wanted to stop him. And it was just like Derek was just madly in love with him. And he just thought, like, oh, yeah, put him in the film, so he wrote a part for him.
You had a great deal of freedom, and he gave a lot of people a lot of opportunity. And he had a great eye for talent, and he had a great eye for using people's talents. And he had a great aptitude of knowing if someone's talent was akin to his own, so that therefore they would relate and they would work like that.
Punk had such an agenda about what was cool and what wasn't cool. And for instance, you know, Toyah was an actress from the National Theatre, and when she first turned up at rehearsal, she had like a brown bob to here, and was in a kind of floral print Laura Ashley skirt or something. And then she was sent off to Keith a Smile and came back with a Dayglow orange crop.
When the film started, the only person I knew was Ian Charleson, who was like a guardian angel. And I had never heard of Jordan. I'd never heard of Sedition Riz, where Jordan worked. I didn't know who Vivienne Westwood was, who Malcolm McLaren was. I'd heard of Susie Sue and The Clash, all these bands that agreed to be part of the film, but within 2 days of filming starting, they pulled out because they said, you know, this film must never be made. It's a rip-off. It's exploitative. So no, I was completely innocent of everything that was going on around me.
Now Jordan, you know, had been commuting from Brighton to her job at Vivienne Westwood's shop Sex and then Sedition Riz every day with this blonde peroxide tidal wave of hair, black kind of, you know, this thick on her face, wearing rubber bra, rubber panties, and you know, and stockings and suspenders and massive fetish high heels. She was commuting from Brighton to Victoria Station, which is an hour-long journey, then taking a bus from Victoria Station to the end of the King's Road, dressed like that in 1975-76. So she had hardcore credentials, because at that time, you know, you've got to remember that in the mid-70s in England, we'd had 3-day weeks, and you know, I mean, it was like the most bleak, miserable time imaginable. So credentials and your kind of, especially your punk credentials, count for a lot. So to have this actress swan in, get a new hairdo, and suddenly she is punk rock, was a little bit, you know, people weren't quite sure about all of that. And similarly, you know, like the Slits were in there in scenes. Adam, obviously, of Adam and the Ants, was there playing a key role. It was very divisive, but at the same time, it was interesting actually watching all the Thesby people, you know, kind of punking out.
It was very different for me to work with Derek as a friend and as working on a project that was of immense interest to both of us, and in a situation, a milieu that was actually happening around us in the time, and we were involved in it anyway. And in all the aspects, so when it wasn't just, I mean, it was a year by the time we were sort of working on the script and started shooting, and then he was editing it, and then I had to go back and do something with sound, and you do this, and then they'd be talking about PR, and then you'd be going this, and then we took it to Cannes. I mean, it was a very personal involvement.
When I first read the Jubilee script, I didn't understand what it was about, and that was partly the naivety of my background. I didn't understand, you know, what Derek's problem was with the royal family. You know, it's a royal family, so what? I mean, why do you want to kill them off so badly? I thought it was incredibly amateur, and I actually felt that the actual filmmaking process was amateur. And at one point, I remember thinking, oh God, have I made a mistake here? Am I on some kind of bizarre, you know, kind of porno movie almost? And it just got better because we all started to understand Derek more as we went along, and that Derek had this ability to kind of throw everything in the air, and from the chaos that was in the air, he could make it fall into a form. And by the end of making Jubilee, I was completely smitten by him.
Originally, they were going to shoot the film in East London, and Derek asked me to sort of like find a counsellor that he could, like, you know, get an application for. And unfortunately, my godfather was a counsellor, so I had Derek and the crew turned up at my dad's pub one day at lunchtime, and this parade of puffs walked into this East London pub, and it was the end of my relationship with my father.
Well, the London locations for Jubilee I mean, I'm not sure that we had permission to do anything, but in those days there were a lot of derelict buildings which hadn't been cleared away after the war still, and bomb sites, which was wonderful for this kind of post-apocalyptic type film. You can't do that now because they're simply not there. As I recall, all we really did was sort of run around and find exciting places to shoot and then shoot in them. Well, collaborating with Derek on the visuals was sort of quite complicated in a sense, because Derek, although he's a wonderful designer, didn't actually impose the designs at all. And we had long conversations, and they go through all sorts of different design concepts, and sometimes very, very grand. And then inevitably they all became simpler and simpler, largely because there was no money, but also because I think that was, in the end, what everyone really wanted.
My job in the movie was pretty much as a production slave. I did it pretty much everything. I was Christopher Hobbs' assistant, and Chris would leave me to do like all the clearing up. And occasionally I got to do a few things on my own. Derek was kind enough to give me a few sort of like, you know, favours.
Christopher and Derek gave me there were half a dozen kind of props. There was a globe of the world. There was a kind of book that was going to be Jordan's history book when she's being the school teacher. There was a little music box, and I was given these things, and Derek just said, do something with these.
One of the things I've always done in films I've worked on are quite a lot of the sort of physical special effects, and certainly in Jubilee there are one or two slightly gruesome ones. One of which was Adamant having his face slashed. Well, one could have done some complicated rubber affair, and it might have looked all right, it might not, but in fact what I did was to use pink soft lavatory paper torn up and soaked in fake blood and splotched on his face, and in the rather dim backlighting that you see in the film, it really looks pretty nasty because you can't quite see what's going on. So the audience does all the work. The audience's lurid imagination fills in all the gaps, and I've had people say that they could see his eyeball hanging out. Well, you know, I didn't do that.
To be honest with you, that film, the only thing I can remember was, as a teenager, is that all I wanted to do was get my leg over. And there I was, surrounded by homosexual men with these really gorgeous women. And I failed miserably to get hold of any of them. I was desperately in love with little Nell, and then she ended up going out with Adamant. And that really annoyed me. But then I fell in love with Hermine, and she was married. So just things got worse and worse.
At that time, I was a beginner in the punk scene. I was only a year in London, having spent 18 years in Birmingham, and I was 19. I hadn't even seen a naked body before. And when we did the first scene with Carl Johnson and Ian Charleson naked in the bed, when we did the run-through, they were dressed, and then we went for a shot, and I pulled back the blanket, and they're naked, and I just completely dried. I stood there mesmerised, and I couldn't get my lines out. And I remember Derek taking me aside, and he said, what's the matter, what's the problem? And I had to confess I'd never seen a naked man before, which completely bemused Derek. And from then on, he was a father figure to me. Mad's look was completely Derek's invention. When he first met me, I had long black hair with yellow and green flicks in front of it. I mean, it was ghastly, naive punk. And he sent me off to a hairdresser and told the hairdresser to shave my head completely. Then Derek and I went off to a fishing shop where he bought me waders and stuck me in waders. And I was Derek's invention, and this kind of fat little bull dyke.
I designed the costumes for the Elizabethan part. The punk part was actually not so much me at all. And I drew them up. They were actually made by somebody from, I think, English ballet, which were not entirely successful. But in fact, I stuffed the sleeves with grass and put wooden boards down her corset.
And they came right down sort of low here into the crutch, and you couldn't sit down in them. And the Elizabethans didn't sit down. They used to lean in these outfits. You could never actually sit down in this dress.
It was interesting that when I designed the things for Queen Elizabeth I, I suggested that we did what she actually had, which was a sort of chalk white face with blue veins painted on it, because that's what was fashionable at the time. And he said, no, 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 no. I want a romantic Queen Elizabeth. I want a very beautiful Queen Elizabeth. You know, I want her sort of ethereal and magical and very dazzling.
I mean, the best thing actually that we did on that, the outfits that the punk gang wear when they go out to murder, like Jane County and whoever it is, you know, these weird random attacks that they did in the film. We made them these uniforms out of green army jumpsuits and we put pink rubber gloves through the epaulets. On the back, we painted the slogan, which were the last few lines from Psycho, you know, he wouldn't even harm a fly. And at one point, there were little photos of pornography were put in window pockets on the jumpsuit. But I also had tampons hanging off, and there was this fantastic moment where all the various actresses, Jordan, Jenny Runacre, Toyah, all the girls who were in the gang, Hermine de Maurienne, bless her, they came to me and they were like, "We have a problem." I was like, "Okay, what is it?" "We have a real problem with wearing tampons on these uniforms." So, "Oh, we'll take them off." I mean, it's a shame because actually, you know, I thought it was kind of quite a powerful thing. You know, it was an aggressive thing, which, you know, at that time punk fashion was all about, confrontation. But anyway, that's nothing. Well, Derek's approach was very interesting. I mean, I think in a way that's what I've learned the most from him, and that I still use myself today, which he had a very passive-aggressive technique. He would surround himself with a whole bunch of very interesting, talented people on, you know, both sides of the camera. And he would set up a situation which he was controlling. But within that, he would let everybody just do what they did, which seemed like a very sloppy, kind of ineffectual kind of way of working. But in actual fact, there was a real method to his madness because he got what he wanted.
When we set up the scene where Mad and Amel kill the policeman, I remember sticking to the script. We were outside. The actor playing the policeman was an incredible guy because he really didn't mind us hitting him for real. We were really punching the shit out of him. But the crying, I think, came from me. I just think I had an instinct about breaking down afterwards, you know, because of all the anger of everything that was going on and letting that kind of female anxiety out. And Derek just went with it. And in many ways, I'm surprised they kept it in the editing sequence because they didn't have to, it wasn't needed. But it was an incredible surge of anger and sexuality as well, because I think Mad's sexual expressiveness was done through violence.
If you look at it, it all looks like a fan magazine, you know, like from that period, from the punk rock period. They were just like, you know, it's just stuck together. I mean, they did it in the editing room. I mean, they shot like loads, as I say, loads and loads. And then then Tom Priestley basically kind of like, you know, structured it as best he could.
Derek's politics is a difficult one because Derek was a very complicated man. He was a good, respectable, well-brought-up English middle-class public school boy, basically. And inside that, there was this sort of turmoil trying to get out. And a lot of it got out into the films. I mean, there are murders and rape and goodness knows what goes in most of his films. They're pretty violent and strange. And I think that was his release.
Well, Derek in politics is quite, you know, it's quite funny because he really was a Tory. I mean, in the end, if you look at the film, it's a deeply conservative film, and he really was a radical Tory. Everything about it is about how terrible England is becoming. And that was that period. He really did see it as a very, you know, he was a very pessimistic man in many respects, full of life when you meet him, but as an artist, he was deeply pessimistic about what the world was going to, you know, turn into, especially England.
Derek's view of the apocalypse absolutely baffled me because I knew nothing about politics. You know, me as an individual, I was very wet behind the ears, and I just didn't know what he was going on about most of the time. And I didn't understand how England could ever fall into a state of war or a state of anarchy. So the whole concept was completely new to me. And I personally, within the space of making Jubilee, which was about 8 weeks, I progressed in my life about 20 years because I just learned so much very quickly. I learned about sexual politics, sexual positions, sexual proclivities, political tastes, art, everything. I mean, it was a tidal wave coming over me. It was just absolutely fascinating. But I didn't agree with Derek's vision of the future. I didn't see it as being something bleak. Now, I think he was miraculous in his predictions.
I mean, the format of the film, in that it's a flash forward from Queen Elizabeth I, is, in a sense, that looking forward from a golden age to the modern age, which is rather less gold. And I think that was, in a sense, Derek being or putting himself into that period of sort of golden perfection that he sort of imagined for himself, as it were, almost.
It actually allowed Derek to feed into the film this whole aspect of, you know, John Dee, who was Elizabeth's kind of mystical advisor and an alchemist. That's actually Derek in the film, in a funny kind of way. Derek was, like I think I said before, you know, he was like a magus. He had there was a very strange kind of mystical, alchemical side to Derek's philosophy.
He saw himself as somebody that was like trying to hold up an image, a mirror image of what was going on in the world, and that's what that Jubilee is. It's kind of like, you know, it's John Dee's mirror against what was going on in England that period.
Jubilee was not a huge success when it opened. It opened in an art house cinema at that time called Gate 2 off the centre of London, and it was not a runaway hit. It was nothing like as successful as Sebastian had been. And I think that that's partly because the mainstream audience, the art house audience, saw it as part of this hated punk movement, that they associated it clearly with what was going on the streets, which most of the mainstream hated. I've always thought that the punk movement was basically an art school thing. But it's very clear that many of the key protagonists in punk were guilty or ashamed of their art school backgrounds or their art school associations in some cases, and did their best to minimize them or erase them as much as they could. And Derek was absolutely art school. I mean, there couldn't be a more obviously, visibly art school take on punk or attitude to punk than Jubilee. That's clearly where it's coming from. And so I think that many of the kids wanted to distance themselves from Jubilee because they saw it as an aspect of their movement that they wanted to repudiate or push to one side.
And at the premiere of Jubilee, you know, the Slits had been in the movie, Adam and the Ants was sort of in there. You know, so punk people turned up to the premiere. There was like a big crowd, and so you had this weird mixture of the sort of glitterati at that time, and Derek's kind of more happy, you know, Lord Sainsbury, people like that were there. And then all these kind of punk kids, kind of noisy yobbos. And I remember one particular moment, there was a scene where Luciana Martinez, who was part of the Andrew Logan crowd, she was hanging out with Borja Gintz. She was one of the kind of chicks who was his sidekicks. She's kind of lashed to a lamppost with barbed wire in front of a poster of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And when she appeared on screen, all the punks in the audience booed, and it was kind of like a really horrible moment. And then Vivian produced this T-shirt, you know, open letter to Derek Jarman, you know, and all this kind of nonsense about, you know, why it wasn't the real film about punk. And obviously Malcolm and Vivian were just pissed off that they didn't have a slice of the action.
Yeah, the night of the premiere, that was like, you know, none of us had seen the film. So, like, we all waited with bated breath after, like, all these, like, you know, months of, like, cutting it into some form. So we go in, and it starts off, and after about a quarter of an hour, somebody got up and started dancing, some hippie girl, and, like, flounced out. Then I think, like, most of the people that worked on the film walked out. Susie the Banshee's, like left in disgust. And by the end of the film, like, it was, like, about 3/4 of the audience left. But it was, you know, it was like you honestly felt that you'd actually, like, been in, like, the most amazing opening of an amazing film you've ever seen in your life, because it was just, like, nothing else like it came out of England, ever. It was just such a sort of, like, snub to everybody that was in the film business. It really was, like, you know, an achievement that got made under the noses of all the scumbags that run in the business, and there we had it.
The film stands the test of time, curiously enough, partly because he didn't try to make a punk movie. He was actually making a movie from his own heart, about his own ideas, poured in. I mean, there are all sorts of ideas pouring around in there. And the fact that it's punk was merely because there were a lot of people, that was the punk movement at that time. It was the sort of ethos of the moment, violence and excitement, and there was a whole new thing going on. And it spills over into the film, and the fact that he used a lot of people who were actually in the punk movement, who were sort of basically beginning bands, like Adamant, who hadn't really sort of hit the big time at that time. He was just trying himself out, and you can see in his work that he's still basically punk before he broke out into New Romantic. All that comes through, and it becomes, to the modern eye, a punk movie. It was never meant to be that. But it pinpoints that moment very, very precisely, I think, because it wasn't trying to, curiously enough.
Derek did have, I think, an enormous influence on a subsequent generation in another way. Not so much the films. Nobody attempted to do what Derek had done or to keep doing what Derek had done. However, his battle against the funding bodies, particularly television in the later years, and his guerrilla methods of making films, particularly his pioneering use of Super 8 and video material, which he then incorporated into 35mm films for release, inspired a huge number of people, I think, to make or to believe that they could make films this way, that it was not necessary to rely on the standard funding bodies, that you could go out there and do it, that you could use simple, cheap materials like video cameras, like Super 8 cameras, that were not enormously costly. You could generate material this way that could end up being screened in a public cinema on something like commercial release. And that, I think, served as a huge inspiration to an entire generation of British filmmakers, actually.
What Derek did do is that it made me realise how easy it was to get things together, and gave me the urge to actually, not easy, it is very hard, but I mean it's possible, and it gave me the urge to do the same myself, which is how I then got into the kind of art video installation stuff that I do myself. So it was actually a sort of inspiration from Derek, that.
And you honestly, like, when you're a kid, you think, like, you want to make movies, that was the way you thought it was done. I mean, you couldn't get a better opportunity to actually, like, nobody was going to give me a job in the film industry, coming from where I come from. And to actually meet up with Derek and all that crowd, it was just the most wonderful thing in the world that could possibly happen to a kid.
Derek Jarman had so many facets, so many sides. It was unbelievable because he could be a sexual predator, he could be a brilliant director, he was a great artist. And that always took me by surprise, that his ability to paint was just as extraordinary as his ability to make films. He was also incredibly fatherly. I mean, there were times after making Jubilee when I was very poor, and he used to give me the bus fare to come over, and he'd make me lunch and stuff like that. So there was a remarkable human being there as well.
The thing was that we both loved movies. It was hard to get him to go to see a film, I've got to be honest with you. He was not exactly a cinephile. But, if you get him to go to the pictures, and he would wax lyrical about it afterwards. He would just love, if he saw a good film. I mean, I took him to see 1941. I don't think he went to see a film for about 4 years after that. But most of the time, he was like, if he saw a good film, he loved you for it. He was like, introduced him to something he hadn't seen before. And so that was the thing we had going. I mean, we were friends for a long time.
In 25 years of my career, and I've worked with some pretty great people and some pretty great places, I think Derek is still so profoundly strong in my memory. The experience mainly actually on The Tempest, where he looked at me as a serious actress, and he took months coaxing me to do The Tempest and persuading me that I could do it. And I will never forget him for that. And I'll never forget him for his humanity and for his strength of conviction and for his remarkable eye and vision. He was just, I've never met anyone like him, and I think about him a lot.
Who was Derek Jarman? He was one of the most important people I ever met. He gave me my first Super 8 camera. But he was kind of everything to all people, I mean, everyone who met Derek thought that he was their best friend. He was my evil, malevolent aunt, that I miss terribly now. But Derek Jarman was a great artist, and he owes an enormous debt to Pasolini. He owes an enormous debt to Fassbinder and a lot of other people. But ultimately, he's a genuine British original. He's the ancestor of Powell and Pressburger, but he also is the ancestor of the Carry On movies. He managed to. And it's what I'm still trying to do today. It's if you can find the marriage of the carry-on and hammer horror movies of the 60s and 70s and the beauty and poetry of the Powell and Pressburger movies, then you have the perfect antidote to the boring side of British cinema like Ken Loach and Mike Leigh. You know, there should be a kind of magic realism about what we do, because this country, from Spencer's The Fairy Queen, you know, onwards, you know, we've had a language of magic and poetry, and I don't think documentary realism is doing that justice. Derek Jarman was a champion of British magic realism.